It is Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019, and this is the Pro and the Con Show. And I'm your host, Michael James Ott, live with you today on Tuesday from my home in Hudson, Wisconsin, a small office in the upstairs area of my house. Welcome to the show, as always, 15 to 20 minutes almost every day. I missed a few days there over the last week. Spending time with my mother, who is encroaching on 90 years old. She'll be 90 here later this year. And so we had a family reunion. It was a nice time. But let's talk about the show. So I do the show, trying to encourage all of us to be better citizens. Well, how do we do that? Well, we open our hearts and our minds to the complexities of the issues, that they're not as simple as a few words on a bumper sticker, okay? And we all have our natural leanings on these things, but we need to set those aside at least momentarily enough to listen to the other people. I mean, we're 340 million people in this country, okay? And we are going to look at the same things differently. And that's not wrong. And in fact, that's right. Okay? There should be not any single one of us that is determining how these complex issues are resolved. We should talk about them at some length. And then once we've done that, we can spend some quality time looking at them from the various perspectives, and we can try to forge policies and laws that make sense to the vast majority of us. It's never going to make sense to everybody because, 340 million people, quite frankly, some people are crazy. Okay. And some people are, so far to the left or so far to the right, they're never going to be agreeable to something that the vast majority of us could agree to. But in any case, we can make it for the vast majority of us. We can do plenty to make things much better going forward. So I wanted to, a lot of times I look at the different websites, some left-leaning, some right-leaning. But today I'd really rather talk about the Second Amendment and gun rights, basically. So like I was saying before, these issues, whether we're talking about abortion or the Second Amendment or freedom of speech or taxation or balancing the budget or go on and on and on. But all of these things are complex, and we are doing ourselves a horrible disservice if we don't take some time to reflect upon the issues in a larger scale, in a more holistic way. So the Second Amendment, I actually have a little app on my phone, has the Second Amendment, it has the Constitution in it. But anyway, I got this from the app, and so the Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed." So, and let me put that up on the screen. You can pause the video so you can read it yourself here. All right. Well, as many things go, the folks that wrote the amendments, which were seemingly fairly quickly written, the original Constitution was ready, and then these concerns over individual rights were raised by the various states. They didn't want to approve the Constitution without some amendments that would be offered. And so they were fairly hastily written, and relative to the rest of the Constitution, certainly. And this one, I wish it was written better, clearer, because here's some issues. So let's just touch on some really critical words in this. So militia, arms, and infringed. Okay, so the beginning it says a well-regulated militia. So a militia, the most common definition, a military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. So this is, I believe it's Norway. I don't know if they still have this, but for years they did have a militia, a well-regulated and practiced militia. And so the various citizens maintained small caches of arms, and they were periodically trained on how to use them and how the militia would come together to throw off potential enemies that might invade their country. And by the way, just in full disclosure, me personally, well, let me say this before I say, guns, modern guns are incredibly powerful weapons. They are incredibly deadly. Even the smallest caliber weapons these days are much more deadly than they were back in the day when the Constitution was written. And they are, and so on, from me being an engineer by training and by profession for many years, I can appreciate the aesthetic and the I don't know, the engineering, I guess, the manufacturing, the quality behind modern weapons. It's amazing. It's amazing, the materials and the shapes and how these things are fitted, and the kind of muzzle velocities that you can get, and the repeatability, when you're firing one shell after another, and how fast you can fire shells, and how reliable these weapons are. There's a whole litany of what manufacturers might want, and modern weapons fit the bill. And so I, being a cautious person and excuse me, I am feeling like generally the environment that here in the United States is generally pretty safe. I don't have a gun, and I personally would not own a gun, at least, maybe at some future time. You never say never. Okay, so at some future time I might, but I wouldn't own one. They seem like they're too dangerous, and so that's one. Relative to the security that I would receive from it. Two, I can have a little bit of a temper, and if people in the heat of the moment can do things, they can lose their control of their mental state, and do something that and I don't even want to entertain that might even be a possibility. But having said that, I do appreciate that this amendment says, having weapons, a prolific number of weapons in this country almost certainly assures us of never being invaded, at least not in any conventional way. Wow. A foreign army kind of tries to go through these shores with whatever it is. It's I think the number of guns and the number of people in this country are roughly the same. So that's a lot of guns, and there's billions of rounds of ammunition. So from the standpoint of remaining a separate nation state and being able to throw off potential foreign enemies, we probably got that licked pretty well. So anyway, let's go back to the Second Amendment. because so the militia, the other address or the other definitions. So it says a military force that engages in rebel or terrorist activities in opposition to a regular army. Now that was what the militia did in the Revolutionary War. So the British Army was the regular army, and our militia of civilians, basically in a rebel or terrorist activity, a guerrilla war, effectively. We threw off the regular army of Great Britain at the time. And another definition is all able-bodied civilians eligible by law for military service. Okay. Arms. Now here's the thing. Arms, they are weapons and ammunition. Arms is short for armaments. So firearms, guns, ordnance, cannon, artillery, tanks, military aircraft, military ships, submarines. These are all arms. They're all armaments. Nuclear weapons. All of these are arms. And then the last word that's in there says shall not be infringed. Well, infringe means to act as to limit or undermine or encroach on. So at the beginning of the article, it says well regulated, but at the end, shall not be infringed. Well, regulation would seem to be a form of infringement. So the real problem then let's step back and just say, okay, holistically then, what do we need to do about this? Well, holistically, I think we need to step back and maybe we need to amend the Constitution to really clarify what we want as a society in regard to armaments held by civilians. Now the problem that we have is there's regulations and laws, but they're piecemeal across the nation, and certainly there's a lot of angst because of the variation in them. And this seems just like the Constitution itself and the fact that the Second Amendment exists. This seems to be a national issue that we should address by, instead of state law after state law after state law, and various challenges in the courts, and keeping our justice system just stockpiled with the various arguments over Second Amendment intent. We should just fix this. Now, and I would also argue, just like all the other things that I argue with you, this is not just gun control. This is a larger issue of, if we're going to have guns and stipulate that we can have guns and people can have guns or they can have arms. Well, I think we need to have, like it says here, a well-regulated militia. Well, maybe a well-regulated national amendment that clearly states, age restrictions, emotional or mental restrictions, training, with the armaments. And then I think there's also like public service, public education kinds of things, and in particular. So there's this article that it was while I was visiting with the family here, but you can read the headline. So, man arrested after 1,000 guns found at his Los Angeles home. Okay, and you can see the pile of guns that this fellow has. So, you know, there are going to be some small percentage of you that say, you know, yes, if a person wants a nuclear weapon, that's an armament. The Constitution says he can have it. Let him. There's, you know, chemical weapons, tanks, bazookas, rockets, mortars. And again, this is why I think we have to just say, okay, look, I think the vast majority of us have to say, okay, what is fair and reasonable here, and I would be perfectly open to, you know, maybe allowing people to have a range of armaments, but certainly the more deadly and more easily that particular armament is to be used to kill more and more people, for example, the worse it was, explosives and mortars and machine guns and tanks and fighter aircraft, and rockets and all this kind of stuff, the more and more regulated it would be, such that it would take, greater and greater oversight to attain these more dangerous weapons, weapons that could affect or hurt, dozens or hundreds at once instead of one or two people at a time. So, so things like single-shot rifles and single-shot shotguns, or maybe rifles and shotguns that have only, very limited chambers, so maybe they can only hold 3 shells or something at a time, and lower calibers and stuff like that. These would be things that you would require less background check. You would require less age. Maybe you need to be older to as these weapons in their destruction power increase. The older you have to be. And for all the same reasons that we regulate, who can drink alcohol and who can drive a car, and as opposed to who drives a bus or who drives a semi, there's, it just makes sense that we would, step by step have a structure of regulation around guns, because they are, just like drugs and alcohol and automobiles and medical, like prescriptions and stuff like that, or even medical, performing medical services and so on. There's regulations around it, because that's how a caring, compassionate, reasoned society would package this. So no one's, don't talk about taking away all the guns. That's not going to happen. And understand that it is a huge benefit that, it truly does protect the United States from, foreign aggressors. But, having 1,000 guns, or, and then, part of the public training and public service announcements around, hey, if you think, this person has guns and lots of ammo, and you start to get concerned about their mental stability, well, there would have to be ways, one, that we're all looking for that, right? So if the guy next door or 2 doors down starts doing stuff and it raises the concerns of a few of the neighbors, well, somehow that should be rightly addressed, because the reality is that as many mass shootings that we've had, or murders using guns, and on and on and on, there have been many of them thwarted, even though we don't really try that hard with some of these public training and public service announcements, that kind of thing. And so the reason why I bring up this particular article with 1,000 guns is because the neighbors realize that this fellow is, putting together this huge cache of weapons, and they started getting concerned. And so at one point, apparently he was potentially making weapons also. And so this combination basically led the neighbors to report him to the police, which I certainly believe was appropriate. I'm sure there's a few, dozens of people. If 340 million people watch this in this country, I'm sure there'd be dozens that would say that they were wrong in doing that. But I believe the vast majority of us, 90% or whatever, would say that was an appropriate thing. Okay? And so you see how we look at some of these issues, and you step back and you open your hearts and your mind to this, hey, that what is reasonable here? What is a way forward that most people can find acceptable? So not no guns and not guns for everybody, and so on, but some, what is it in between that we can all live with and make sense? Okay, and then you try that, you put in the policies and regulations and laws, and then you can revisit them. You could put this legislation in place and say every 3 years or every 5 years, we're going to reopen this particular issue or this package of legislation and see what's working, see what isn't working, see if we should or propose some other regulation or change in for example, the age where people could legally start having guns, or having guns of a certain lethal potential. All right, well, time's up for today. Michael James Ott, The Pro and Con Show for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. Thanks for watching. Another show tomorrow. And until then, bye for now.